To our second lesson on types of compounds. Previously, we looked at ionic compounds. In this lesson, we're going to look at molecular compounds. Just like we did previously in that lesson, I asked you to identify all the ionic compounds from that list. This is a different list, and I want you to identify all the molecular compounds from this list. So you're looking at, if you remember, if you have a compound and all of the elements in that compound are nonmetals, that's when you know that you've got a molecular compound. So pause the video for a second, try and identify which of these are molecular compounds. Okay, so I'm going to show you the answers. So molecular compound, so NO3, nitrogen oxide, molecular. This is also molecular. You would consider Br2, that's a bit of a weird example, but if you think about the rules, there's two bromine atoms here. They're both nonmetals, which means that this is a molecular compound. This is also molecular. Right? In all of these examples, you only have nonmetals. In the other one, so lithium chloride, sodium fluoride, aluminum phosphide, magnesium oxide, sodium phosphide, all of those have a metal, at least one metal and a nonmetal, which means that they're all ionic. Okay, so when you're given a compound, a molecular compound specifically, how would you name this particular compound? So the first step that you have to always do is name the first element. And just like an ionic compound, the name of the first element really doesn't change much. So I'm going to maybe write it over here. So it is nitrogen. Okay, so first element is done. The second element, so I'm going to name the second element with IDE at the end. So the second element that I have in my compound is oxygen, but I'm going to change the ending to IDE. So instead of oxygen, I'm going to write oxide. Okay, that seems pretty good, but we're not done yet. Now we have to add prefixes. If you look over to the right side of this, slide, you will notice a bunch of numbers and a prefix with it. A prefix is a term that you add before the name of a name in general, right? So depending on the number of atoms that you have, you would add a particular prefix. So here, N2O, two N's means that there's two nitrogens. The number 2 atoms corresponds with the prefix di. So I'm going to add di right before the nitrogen. So I've written dinitrogen. And then when it comes to the oxygen, I've got one oxygen here. So one oxygen, or one atom, tells me that the prefix is mono. So dinitrogen, I'm going to add monoxide. So the name of this particular compound is dinitrogen monoxide. Now let's do another example. In this one, you're doing the exact same thing, so maybe pause it and try and do it by yourself and then come back. So name the first element. This is easy because we just did it. Nitrogen. And then name the second element with IDE at the end of it. Again, oxide. And then we're going to add the prefixes. So in nitrogen, so let's do oxygen first. There is one oxygen here. So I'm going to leave that as monoxide. Now here's an exception. It's not an exception. This is a rule that we always have to follow. If the first element there's only one of them, you do not add a prefix. So I'm going to write that over here. If the first added. So in our previous example, we had more than one of that first element, which was nitrogen. We had dinitrogen, and we had to have that prefix. In this case, the reason why I picked this example is because it's the same set of elements, but however, in this case, the first element is there's only one of it. There's only one atom of it. So we don't need to add a prefix. So it's just nitrogen monoxide. S2Cl2, again, do this by yourself, and then maybe you can check your answers. So first element is sulfur. Next element with IDE at the end of it, this is chlorine. So the name would be chloride. Let's add our prefixes. There's 2 of the sulfur, which means that I'm going to do disulfur. And there's 2 of the chlorines, which means I'm going to do dichloride. So it's disulfur dichloride. Let's look at another example. So in this case, I've got chlorine coming first because it's the first element. I'm not changing anything about that first element. So I'm going to write it as chlorine. And my second element with an IDE at the end of it, oxide. Let's add our prefixes. 2 chlorines means that I'm doing dichlorine. And 7 oxygens, so 7 is hepta, means that I'm doing heptoxide. So dichlorine heptoxide. Let's do the opposite. So if we're given a name, how do we figure out the chemical formula for this compound? My first step is to write out the first chemical symbol. So my first element is sulfur, so I'm going to write S. My second element is fluoride. Remember that we're changed the ending to IDE, so even though it says fluoride, I know we're talking about fluorine, so I'm going to write F. Add numbers according to the prefixes. So sulfur, even though it's coming first, does not have a prefix. And remember what that means. If it does not have a prefix, that means that there's just one of sulfur. So I'm good to leave that as is. And then the second element says tetrafluoride. So I know that tetra means 4. And I know that there are 4 of these fluorines, so the chemical formula is SF4. I'm going to just write that closer together. Eraser. I'm going to erase this and this. Let me just write that one more time. So the compound that I have is SF4. Okay, let's do another example. Diphosphorus pentasulfide. First element is phosphorus. I'm going to write P. Second element is sulfide. So because it's IDE, I know we're talking about sulfur. So I'm going to put S. So those are my element symbols for my first and second element. And we're only going to be looking at scenarios where you have 2 elements, so you don't need to worry about any other type of molecular compound. And now we're going to add our numbers according to the prefixes. So phosphorus had the prefix di, and di corresponds to 2, so P2. And sulfide had penta, so penta means 5, so there are 5 of those sulfur. So my compound is P2 as 5. So there's a bunch of practice here for you. Hopefully you're able to do it. Pause the video, try it yourself. I'm going to write out the answers so that you can check to make sure you've got the right ones. So this one is iodine heptafluoride. This one is sulfur hexafluoride. The next one is tetraphosphorus. that's a long word, and hexoxide. The last one that I see here, dinitrogen. Dinitrogen trioxide. Hopefully those ones made sense. Let's do the opposite, where you're given a name and you're writing the chemical formula for it. So sulfur dioxide, SO2. Nitrogen trioxide, NO3. Dinitrogen pentoxide, N2O5. So that was it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or ask me or let me know so that I can explain it to you maybe one more time. So that's pretty much it for our types of compounds.